Good morning. Welcome again to Morning Devotions as we enjoy walking through the Word of God together. As we've read through the Bible this year, one of the things that we've learned is that many times our definitions, our perceptions, our conceptions of things in the Bible are all wrong. For instance, when we studied the fact that Moses was the humblest man that ever lived, we realized that maybe the Christian definition of humility needs to be adjusted because it's become religious and spiritual and no longer biblical. As we've read through the words of Jesus, we realize that the concept of gracious words needs to be changed because people have equated gracious words with just never taking a stand and never saying what's right and what's wrong. When we see Jesus most assuredly did that, but his words were gracious words. Today is again one of those things that we're going to change our perceptions about, and that's the Last Supper. Because the Last Supper was a real letdown for Jesus. What? Yeah, it was a real letdown for Jesus. Now, notice that Jesus really wanted to do the Last Supper. In our text today, in Luke chapter 22, it says in verse 15, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." This is something Jesus was excited about. This is something Jesus really wanted to do. This is something that Jesus was really looking forward to. He had it planned in the Essene community. You say, how do you know that, Pastor? Well, because he said, go find a man carrying a pot of water. The only men that carried water in Jerusalem at that time were the Essene community because basically they were celibate. There were no women among them. Now, why did he choose the Essene community? Probably because it was safe and because there was no corruption there. Now, these people were extremely legalistic. I mean, forgive me for the illustration, but they were so legalistic, an Essene man would not even defecate on the Sabbath day because defecation was considered work. He would have to hold it until after the Sabbath was finished. Oh my goodness, don't get any bad food the day before Sabbath, you know? But this was a very legalistic group, but they were also untouched by the corruption of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So it would have been a very safe place. He planned a special time together for their last meal. He loved these men. He eagerly anticipated it. And I want you to see the reality of what the Last Supper was really like for Jesus. First of all, we have John the Beloved sitting on one side of him, but to the next side of him, guess who's sitting next to him? Judas. That's right, the guy, he dips his bread with me in the bowl. He had to be sitting right next to Jesus. Judas Iscariot. And remember, Judas was Satan-possessed at this time. Now again, look back to chapter 22. Satan entered Judas in verse 3. This is before the Last Supper. So at the Last Supper, Jesus is sitting next to the devil all night long inside of Judas. What a bummer. Now that makes you begin to understand why in verse 31, Jesus said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat." I wonder when Satan asked to do that. Probably sitting right next to him at dinner that night. Satan inside of Judas leans over and says, "Jesus, I'm asking permission to sift Simon like wheat." I mean, poor Jesus. He really wanted this beautiful Last Supper. And he's sitting next to Satan-possessed Judas all night long. Then it goes on. He serves them what we call the communion. He gives them the cup, then the bread, then he gives them the cup a second time. And then the disciples begin to argue among themselves. Which is among us the greatest? Verse 24. Now, put yourself in Jesus' place. He's sitting there next to the devil all night. The disciples don't even realize Satan is among them. The disciples, when they begin to say who's going to betray Jesus, don't even recognize that Satan is inside of Judas, sitting right there at the table with them. And Jesus has had to put up with that all night long. Now the disciples begin to argue among themselves, who's the greatest? Now forgive me, the Last Supper was a little bit of a letdown for Jesus. A little bit of a letdown. So when you and I begin to think of the Last Supper means everything to us. Communion was instituted. But for Jesus, the Last Supper was a difficult evening. He had to sit next to the devil all night long. He had listened to the disciples argue who among them was the greatest. If you would have looked at the Last Supper as an independent observer, you would think there is no hope for this group. But now here's the kicker. Those men went out and changed the world. Brothers and sisters, you look around the church, there's no perfection. But just like the apostles, we can go out and change the world.